Was a certain loss, there was a certain adriftness within my own heart and life and where I was going and what I was doing and how I was going to carry on.
A single phone call, received while driving to the beach, destroyed the opportunity that should have changed Pierce Brosnan's life forever. At the time, he had no idea that an even greater tragedy was already waiting for him at home, one that haunted his family across 2 generations. To the world, he became the perfect James Bond. Even after becoming one of Hollywood's biggest stars, the hardest battles of his life were fought far away from movie sets. So what really happened inside Pierce Brosnan's family? And what secret did he finally reveal in his 70s that left fans seeing him in a completely different light? Stay with us, because the full story is even more devastating than most people realize. Pierce Brendan Brosnan was born on May 16, 1953 in County Meath, Ireland, the only child of a father who left before any real memory of him could form, and a mother named May who made an equally difficult choice years later, leaving for London to train as a nurse rather than staying behind with no way to properly support a growing son. 4 different addresses followed across a single childhood, first grandparents, then an aunt and uncle after their deaths, and finally a boarding house run by a woman named Eileen Riley. Each move arriving without much warning and without much explanation offered to a boy still too young to fully understand any of it. Real happiness still found a way into that same unstable childhood, arriving through a grandfather's hand to hold, a landlady's children to run the streets alongside, and a small slide projector that turned a plain bedroom ceiling into a private cinema screen most evenings. One Christmas broke through that fragile happiness anyway. A mother's work keeping her away from home entirely, replaced instead by a pair of boxing gloves left in her absence, gloves that stayed on a shelf for decades afterward without any explanation ever really required. Reunion finally arrived at age 11, rejoining a mother now remarried to a man named William Carmichael in England. Though a new home brought a new kind of isolation entirely, classmates mocking an Irish accent almost immediately and turning a simple identity into something that needed defending before it could ever be worn with any real pride. A film scene during those very first difficult weeks quietly planted something that would take decades to fully bloom. Sean Connery commanding an entire screen with a kind of control a lonely Irish boy had never once felt inside his own life. School ended at 16 with nothing but a folder of drawings and a private dream of becoming a painter rather than a performer. Acting arriving almost by accident through an experimental theater workshop that demanded presence and stillness rather than the constant movement and unstable childhood had already trained into every instinct. 3 years of formal training at the Drama Centre London followed, a discipline that asked something an uprooted boy had never truly been given the chance to practice, standing completely still and simply being seen. Small stage work in York opened an entire professional life in 1975. Modest pay and modest roles building real discipline anyway. Arrive prepared, hold the room, earn another night on the same unglamorous stage. Tennessee Williams himself noticed something worth encouraging 2 years later, casting a young Brosnan in a London production and sending along a brief note of praise that offered real encouragement without offering anything close to instant fame. Television finally delivered what years of small film roles never quite managed. A con man posing as a detective on NBC's Remington Steele, turning an unknown actor into a familiar face inside American living rooms every single week starting in 1982. That same tailored charm made an entire audience start imagining a future that hadn't happened yet. And in 1986, an offer to become James Bond arrived right on schedule, only to collapse entirely on the very last day of a contractual window while Brosnan was reportedly walking toward a beach with champagne in hand to celebrate. 8 more years passed before that particular door reopened. 8 years that included a loss far heavier than any missed film role could ever compare against. Cassandra Harris entered Pierce Brosnan's life in London during the mid-1970s, already a mother of 2 young children from an earlier marriage, and rather than remaining a guest inside that ready-made family, Brosnan stepped fully into the center of it, formally adopting both children after their biological father died in 1986. Marriage followed in 1980, a son named Sean arriving 3 years later, and through every uncertain stretch of an actor's unpredictable income, Cassandra remained the steady hand an entire household quietly depended on. Illness arrived without warning in 1987 while the family filmed together in India. An unusual exhaustion and a swelling abdomen leading to a diagnosis nobody wanted to hear: ovarian cancer, the same disease that had already taken Cassandra's own mother decades earlier. 8 surgeries and roughly 4 years of treatment followed, described honestly in an interview not long after her death as a real fight from the very first day. An illness that had invaded her entire being rather than remaining some small, contained thing easily managed from the sidelines. The year 1987 became a turning point in Pierce Brosnan's life for reasons the public would not understand until decades later. While his wife, Cassandra Harris, was fighting ovarian cancer, he found himself searching for a way to cope with emotions too overwhelming to put into words. Acting demanded that he step into someone else's life, but grief demanded something entirely different. Without any formal training or intention of ever exhibiting his work, Brosnan picked up a paintbrush as an adult for the very first time. It was not the beginning of a new career. It was an attempt to survive one of the darkest periods of his life. Very quickly, brushes alone no longer seemed enough. He began pressing his fingers directly into wet paint, dragging color across the canvas with his hands instead of creating distance through traditional techniques. The process became intensely personal, almost instinctive, allowing feelings that refused to surface in conversation to emerge through layers of color and texture instead. There were no critics to impress, no galleries waiting, and no audience in mind. Every canvas existed solely because it gave fear, uncertainty, and heartbreak somewhere to live outside his own thoughts. That quiet ritual never stopped. While audiences watched him become one of Hollywood's most recognizable leading men, the paintings continued to accumulate behind closed doors. James Bond premieres, blockbuster films, interviews, and red carpet appearances occupied the public side of his life. But away from the cameras, he returned repeatedly to the same private space where paint became a language words could never quite match. Friends knew little about the scale of the collection, and even many of those closest to him had no idea how deeply painting had become woven into his daily life. The very first painting he completed remained hidden for more than 30 years. It was filled with recurring symbols, fragmented self-portraits, and imagery that Brosnan would later describe as drawing inspiration from ancient Celtic mythology and deeply personal memories. Looking back, that canvas became something of a roadmap for everything that followed, containing themes of identity, loss, resilience, and family that would appear again and again throughout his later work. Yet despite the emotional importance of those early pieces, he never felt ready to let anyone else see them. Only in 2023 did that hidden world finally become public. Brosnan unveiled his debut solo exhibition, So Many Dreams, revealing 50 completed paintings and more than 100 drawings created quietly across 36 years. Visitors expecting celebrity artwork instead found something far more intimate. The exhibition felt less like a celebration of artistic achievement and more like opening a personal journal that had been locked away for decades. Every canvas carried traces of experiences that millions of fans had never realized existed behind the polished image of one of cinema's most recognizable stars. Speaking about the exhibition afterward, Brosnan admitted that displaying his paintings felt more frightening than appearing in front of any film camera. Throughout his acting career, he had always been protected by characters, scripts, directors, and costumes. Painting removed every one of those barriers. There was no James Bond, no fictional role, and no carefully crafted performance standing between himself and the audience. What people saw on those canvases was simply Pierce Brosnan, with all the vulnerability he had spent years keeping private. The paintings also became his way of processing later tragedies. When news broke in 2018 that his close friend Anthony Bourdain had died, Brosnan immediately walked into his studio. Instead of giving interviews or making public statements, he painted Bourdain's portrait that very morning. It was an instinctive response rather than a planned tribute, reinforcing something he had learned decades earlier while caring for Cassandra. Whenever grief became too heavy for conversation, painting remained the one place where it could exist honestly without explanation. Meanwhile, Cassandra's illness continued to worsen. By late 1991, Treatment was no longer focused on recovery, but on giving the family whatever precious time remained. Brosnan would later confess one regret that stayed with him long after her death. Throughout her illness, he never asked Cassandra whether she was afraid. She had carried herself with such extraordinary courage that he simply assumed she wanted to protect everyone else from seeing fear, and he never found the words to ask. Near the end, inside her hospital room, an actor who had memorized countless scripts throughout his career found himself unable to read even a few simple religious passages aloud. Standing beside her bed, he stumbled over almost every sentence, apologizing repeatedly as emotion overwhelmed him. On December 28, 1991, just one day after the couple's 11th wedding anniversary, Cassandra Harris died at only 43 years old. Later that same day, Brosnan sat with 8-year-old Sean to explain what had happened. The little boy listened quietly before giving an answer his father would never forget. James Bond couldn't protect the people he loved. Timothy Dalton eventually stepped away from the role that had once slipped through Brosnan's fingers. And in June of 1994, Pierce Brosnan was formally introduced to the world as the 5th James Bond. Children in remote Papua New Guinea already shouting the character's name at him 2 days later despite not a single frame of footage having reached any theater yet. GoldenEye arrived in 1995 after a 6-year absence for the entire franchise, an uncertain Cold War-era character now facing a world that no longer made obvious sense. And against every reasonable doubt, the film became an international success, pulling in more than $350 million worldwide, the strongest commercial result the series had ever posted up to that point. Real vindication arrived buried somewhere inside all of that box office success. Nearly 2 decades of stage work, small film roles, one shattered contract, and a grief that had nothing whatsoever to do with acting finally converging into a single moment audiences accepted completely, without hesitation, right from a very first mission. Charlotte Brosnan grew into a devoted mother, a loving wife, and by every account, including her own father's, one of the warmest presences an entire family ever produced, building a life alongside partner Alex Smith and their 2 children, Isabella and Lucas. Then, nearly 2 decades after watching the exact same disease take her own mother, Charlotte received an identical diagnosis, ovarian cancer arriving for a second generation of the very same family. 3 years of treatment followed while Charlotte continued raising her children anyway, refusing to let illness fully define an already difficult stretch of ordinary family life. Weeks before the end, in June of 2013, she married Alex Smith, a wedding built not around extra time but around the complete absence of it. And on June 28th of that same year, Charlotte died in London at 41 years old, surrounded by her husband, her children, and her brothers Christopher and Sean. Brosnan's public statement called her his darling daughter, closing with a prayer that a cure for what he called this wretched disease might finally arrive soon enough to spare someone else the exact same call. A year later, standing before cameras at the 24 Stand Up to Cancer broadcast, Brosnan spoke publicly about holding 2 different hands through 2 entirely different deaths, a wife and then, decades later, a daughter, taken by the exact same illness. Nothing more really needed explaining after that. An entire audience already understood. The love story that began after tragedy. Pierce Brosnan met journalist Keely Shea Smith at a party in Mexico in 1994, 3 years after Cassandra's death, and the very same year Bond finally became real again. And rather than needing her to erase anything that came before, Keely brought an entire career of her own into the relationship instead. Environmental reporting, eventually growing into filmmaking and advocacy work defending vulnerable coastlines across Mexico and California. Marriage followed in 2001 in County Mayo, Ireland, sons Dylan and Paris arriving in 1997 and 2001. An entire household built wide enough to hold Cassandra's memory, Pierce's adopted and biological children from an earlier life, and 2 new sons growing up alongside every bit of it without anything ever needing to be replaced. When Charlotte died in 2013, Keely never once tried stepping into the space of a mother or a daughter this family had already lost, remaining exactly who she already was throughout an entire second wave of grief. A steady wife rather than a substitute for anyone. Brosnan has described the real foundation of that marriage in almost stubbornly unglamorous terms, solving problems together year after year, and simply liking one another. Keely answering back with 2 words of her own, best friends. Pierce Brosnan didn't just survive an entire lifetime of loss through painting alone. That same instinct apparently passed itself down directly into both younger sons as well. Pierce Brosnan has built a real creative career of his own across painting and photography, holding solo exhibitions in Los Angeles and later Kuala Lumpur throughout 2025. Work critics have repeatedly described as visibly echoing an entire body of work his own father spent decades keeping private. Dylan has pursued a creative path of his own as well, growing up, like Paris, between Malibu and Hawaii, close to the exact same ocean both parents spent years fighting to protect. None of that happened by simple accident. A man who once picked up paint during the single most frightened moment of an entire life, because no other language existed for what he was feeling, somehow raised 2 sons who now reach for the same tools for what appears to be the exact same reason. Grief didn't just move through Pierce Brosnan alone. It moved through an entire household, and generation after generation, it kept coming back out as something people wanted to build rather than something that made them disappear. Christopher Brosnan, adopted alongside Charlotte after Dermot Harris's death, grew up close to an industry that had already defined his father, studying screenwriting and directing before working behind the camera on several of Pierce's own productions, including Tomorrow Never Dies and The Thomas Crown Affair. 19 years old when Cassandra died, old enough to fully absorb an entire loss most children are spared, Christopher later faced real struggles of his own, leading Pierce by 2005 to draw a boundary he believed an entire family genuinely needed, not out of anger, but out of a hard recognition that real love alone cannot force another adult toward recovery. Even so, Christopher was never once erased from how his father spoke about an entire family, named directly alongside his brothers in a 2022 Father's Day message closing simply with love, always, to his sons. Pierce Brosnan is still working, recently trading an entire polished spy image for the grid of boxing trainer Brendan Ingle in Giant, still painting, still stepping into galleries that once seemed impossible for any actor to enter as anything other than a curious guest. Since 2001, he has served as a UNICEF Ireland ambassador, and since Charlotte's death, he and Keely have supported ovarian cancer research directly. An entire private catastrophe slowly turned into something that might spare another family the exact same 2 phone calls decades apart. Around him now sits Keely, 5 children across 2 marriages, grandchildren, and a body of work stretching from 4 Bond films to hundreds of paintings nobody even knew existed until he finally decided an entire world was ready to see them. A boy who once learned love meant waiting for someone who could only come home a few times a year grew into a husband holding his wife's hand while she died, and then, decades later, a father doing the exact same thing for his own daughter. Somewhere in between all of that, he found a way to turn an entire lifetime of grief into something people can actually stand in front of and look at. James Bond made Pierce Brosnan famous, but it's the paintings and the sons now making their own right alongside him that reveal who he actually turned out to be underneath all of it. Decades of quiet grief, real resilience, and an unexpected second identity as an artist continues shaping a story still very much in motion today. What part of Pierce Brosnan's real story surprised you the most? Drop a comment down below. James Bond made Pierce Brosnan famous, but it's the paintings and the sons now making their own right alongside him that reveal who he actually turned out to be underneath all of it. Decades of quiet grief, real resilience, and an unexpected second identity as an artist continues shaping a story still very much in motion today. What part of Pierce Brosnan's real story surprised you the most? Drop a comment down below.